Hey, what's going on YouTube? It's Jedi Ranger from his workshop, but not today. And this is the start of a new series. It's going to be a short one, and I'm not going to return to it ever, really. It's going to be maybe 3 or 4 videos. It's going to be about everything a beginner needs to know about guitars. So you can ignore the fact that this one only has 5 strings. Probably can't even tell because usually the 6th is always, or I guess the 1st string is always super thin. This first episode is going to be about string gauges and pick shapes and all that stuff. So I won't need this. Alright, so up first we have this. If you can't tell what it is, this is a guitar pick. I'm trying to hold it. One of the biggest effects, or one of the biggest things that affects your tone, much rather, is the guitar pick you use. Now this guitar pick, if you can't tell, is uber thin. If you could do that, this is just in my opinion, if you can do this to a guitar pick, it's too thin. If you can bend a guitar pick basically at all, it's too thin, in my opinion. But that's just it, my opinion. Which brings us to what is the quote-unquote correct type of guitar pick to use. So, if you're using a standard size pick and you're just beginning, I would go on the thinner side, but this is a little bit too thin because if I bent this far enough, it would snap in half. Eddie Van Halen is known for using fairly thin picks, aside from his metal guitar pick, but aside from that, his plastic ones, and even the plastic ones you can buy today, are made to be quite thin. However, they do bend as far as this pick, but they won't break like this pick would. So I actually don't mind those. I don't really like thin picks. I personally use John Petrucci Jazz 3s, which are shorter than normal picks, but just as wide, and are very, very thick compared to quote-unquote normal guitar picks. The thicker the pick, usually the more tack you get from the strings. However, with a super thick pick like I use, it gets kind of hard to strum. So if I do end up strumming at all, I do gravitate toward a thinner pick. Not this thin, but thinner than my normal John Petrucci Jazz 3s. The only real way to figure out what you need is to feel. It's all what you want. I really like thicker picks. I've always liked thicker picks. But what I would do, personally, because I haven't had to go pick shopping in a long time, what I would personally do is go out to some mom and pop guitar shop, see if they have any picks that you could just use, try them out, and see if you like any of them. Some of the most common picks are Jim Dunlop, the green ones. You've seen the green ones, I assume. They're bright green guitar picks. They're Tortex material, which is, I think, a celluloid material, if I'm correct. I don't know a ton about guitar picks, honestly, but I do know how I like mine to feel. But that's the whole point. It's all about feel. Because these are very, very clunky to me, because I would have grabbed it right about here, and that's not good. You don't want any edge. You want to grab you don't want to grab a pick like this, by the way. Grab it, hold it tight like this. Your knuckle right here should be right above this, but this is really big compared to what I like, so I would gravitate toward grabbing it like this, so I don't need all that, and I like thicker picks, so this is too thin. so I gravitated towards the John Petrucci picks. So now that we're halfway through this recording, I'm going to switch over to strings. Guitar strings are just as important as guitar picks when it comes to your sound, but it's all about the feel. I personally use a couple different gauges depending on what I'm using. If I have a 12 string, I tend to play with 10 gauge strings because they're thick but not overly thick. Because I don't need a drop tune, but I also want some tuning stability, and I'm not going to be bending strings, so 10 gauge is perfect for that. If you want to bend strings, I would go 9 or lighter, unless for some reason you like hating yourself or something, or I guess maybe you're Stevie Ray Vaughan, in which case you can go 11 or higher, which is a bad idea if you want to bend strings because it will hurt your fingers. That's the whole point. I play with 11 gauge strings on things with trem systems usually, because 11 gauge strings have a tighter pull and they're stronger, so they're less likely to break under heavy stress. But on things like my SG, or I guess on things like semi-hollow bodies, it's not as important to use a light gauge when you're bending strings because you don't really bend strings all that much. The other really important thing to remember is that, once again, it's all up to feel. I used to love 9 gauge strings, and I still do, but I use 9 gauge strings on things without a tremolo system, or really just anything with a hardtail, aside from 12 strings, because I use 10 gauges on that because I don't need to bend strings at all, because they're lighter and I can bend them really far. You can get about 1.5 steps if you're really good at it. Let's see, what else? I guess there are different, not necessarily, like there are different brands of strings, obviously. I personally use Ernie Ball Super Slinkies for 9 gauge, Power Slinkies for 11 gauge, and just the regular Slinkies for 10 gauge. My recommendation is to start out with 9 gauge strings as a beginner, either 9 or 10 gauge strings. Any lighter and you're bound to break them over and over and over and over again. So don't go out there playing with Zippy Slinkies, which are 7 gauge strings and so thin that you can barely even see them. But at the same time, you don't want to go out there with 13s and break your fingers. So it's a balancing act. So I would recommend starting with either a 9 gauge or a 10 gauge, depending on how strong or weak your fingertips are. Mine now are strong enough that I can play on 12 gauge strings even, but I still prefer 11 gauge because I can still bend a lot better. So I'd recommend starting with 9 gauge strings. The other thing about strings is they can be out of different materials, or they can be coated or wrapped or whatever. So Ernie Ball is known for this. They have plenty of different varieties of slinky strings. When it comes to their Super Slinky strings, what I prefer to use is their standard, just normal Super Slinkies. But they also have, I believe, Slinky Cobalt strings. They have, so Cobalt is meant for like extra output. It adds more. There's also another thing that's similar to that. I don't remember the name of it, but it looks similar to the Slinky Cobalt packaging. It's just not, it doesn't say Cobalt on it. But for my 11 gauge strings, I like, what's it called? The Rock and Roll Slinkies. So they are made, they're made of nickel, and they're also nickel wound. So nickel wound strings have a more vintage tone, in my opinion. They sound more vintage, but I also just like the feel of the nickel as opposed to the normal steel. And really, that's about it for this video. I don't know what else to put on here. It's just go out and find a guitar, play with a thin-ish, like a normal gauge string, and try out some picks. For me, light is too light to be used. Medium is barely light enough, or barely heavy enough to be used. Heavy is normal to me. I like heavy strings. That's just how I go. But to each their own. Although, you gotta remember, if it does this, it's probably too thin, especially if it breaks afterward. But that'll probably be it for today. This is Jedi Ranger from his workshop, but not today. May the Force be with you, and goodbye.
Thanks for watching, and please consider subscribing if you enjoy the content on this channel.